Let me strap in.
Buckle up, boys and girls. The debut column of Tom Palmer Jr.'s Palmer's Picks.
For my money, this was the reason why I bought Wizard Magazine month in, month out. Whenever I got rid of my Wizard magazines, I cut out the Palmer's Picks of every single one of those magazines and put them in the scrapbook. Eventually I lost that just in several moves. What a service Tom Palmer Jr. provided for us.
I started reading Wizard a couple issues after this, so from the very first issue I read, Palmer's Picks was part of it. And what this column is, Tom Palmer, a high school student at the time this was written, this first column.
Tom Palmer Jr., son of the famous inker.
Legendary inker.
Yeah, who inked incredibly tough pencilers to ink. Gene Colan on the Dracula book, and Neil Adams on a lot of things.
Yep. He was doing work for the Simonsons, and whenever Gareb Shamus had covered them in a previous issue, is how those paths all crossed. And so Tom Palmer tried to figure out what he could bring to this. At the time, he had kind of moved away from some of the superhero books and was more of a comics journal type fan. And so that's what he did. He wrote, the article that he wanted to write, essentially shining a spotlight on some comics that were outside of that Marvel DC realm. That's essentially what this column becomes. His first column focuses on Neil Gaiman's Sandman.
Plays it safe this issue.
Pretty good choice. Sandman isn't being covered anywhere else, barely mentioned in the Sam Keith interview.
The difference that Sandman would have compared to most of the stuff that's being covered is that this is like the one instance where you can comfortably point to Sandman as being a writer-driven book, where almost every other comic being put out by the big two is pretty much art-driven in terms of fan interest at this point in time, 1992.
Absolutely, and a lot of the books that he goes on to cover would be much more literary. They include things, what we would think of as alternative comics, a lot of Fantagraphics books that do sort of go into that literary comics movement that we would see in the 21st century. But it's just a lot of exposure to, one, it was different than everything else in the magazine, but exposure to a lot of comics that I would never hear of, look at if I did see them, if it weren't for hearing kind of what they're about, seeing some samples of them in his columns and thinking that looks interesting, and then tracking them down.
Absolutely broadened my horizons to what is out there being done in comics. Almost everybody's first introduction to people like Dave Lapham, people like Paul Pope, it wouldn't have happened without this Palmer's Picks article. Yeah,
and that stuff always, one of my attractions to comics, especially once I got access to comic book stores, was finding these weird, underground, alternative, self-published, just stuff that was like, I've never seen anything like this.
That's the other thing with Tom Palmer Jr. is his taste levels really matched mine in a lot of ways. So he was on point. It's like he curated comics for me. Now, he did do 2 Palmer's Picks where he highlighted Hepcats as being cool, but we're not going to hold that against him.
That'll be a conversation for another episode. Maybe not his best look, but I think he was the first time I saw Chris Ware, I think, was in a Palmer's Picks.
That's something that's going to come up a lot, too, in these Palmer's Picks and other subsequent interviews that will be peppered throughout future Wizard magazines, is there was a holy trinity of comics that other cartoonists were reading. Mm-hmm. And at the time, that trinity was Chris Ware's Acme Novelty Library, Dan Clow's 8-Ball, and Peter Bagg's Hate. So just seeing those titles repeated over and over and over again, how could it not lead you into discovering those comics and trying to give those things a shot? I remember I was very gun shy when I came across those series, because just an individual issue would cost five to 6 times more than your average newsstand comic book, and that would have been a week and a day's worth of school lunch, which is how that's how I got my budget for buying comics. So it was a big investment for me to buy it, like a $6 issue of 8-Ball or Acme Novelty. But I never went back after. You know what I mean? Chris Claremont leaves X-Men. There's a void in my comics buying. And then I see something like Palmer's Picks, and he's pointing me in the directions of comics that are made by cartoonists, people who handle all the art chores. And that's why I say he's playing it safe here, is just because it's still a mainstream book.
It is, for sure. But man, in hindsight, this looks like a great kickoff column. You know,
Interesting.
Like what would be a better choice to start this column than because Sandman's still pretty young. You know, like there are 20-some issues or so, you know, into Sandman at this point. A couple of collections have come out. It's enough that he can write about the series and give an overview that it is this anthology series, that he is, you know, featuring different artists telling these stories that range quite a bit. It's a really good kickoff, I think, for what this column would be, and a pretty good accessible entry point for people who pick up this book for a Sam Keith cover of the Hulk and go, well, you know, I guess I'll read this column since I have it.
He uses very progressive language for these quote-unquote collections. He calls them novels.
I wonder when people start to recognize that. You know, obviously he doesn't coin the term graphic novel. It had been around, but you don't see comics written about that way, at least not in Wizard magazine.
Right.
You know, and I think, again, Neil Gaiman being the choice here is a perfect fit for that kind of classification and description.
Interesting prognostication from Neil Gaiman. I guess he's asked how far he sees Sandman going, and he imagines that he's going to close it out with a 50th issue. The series ended up going to 75 issues, so I thought that was just like a fun little anecdote that I pulled from the stuff here.
You know, that's unusual even now for a series to run that length and to be planned that way. Amazing foresight on the part of, or vision on the part of Neil Gaiman. I think about vision a lot for successful cartoonists and the guys who sort of stick around or transcend the monthly new book. And Gaiman had it here, you know.
I give a lot of credit to Karen Berger,
yes,
too, because he wanted to be the guy to write every issue. It started to get behind at times, and they were okay with that. He didn't make an ultimatum to the company, but he kind of did by saying that if anybody writes a 76th issue, I just will never make any work for you ever again. So he played that very smart, too, because perhaps if Alan Moore would have said something in that kind of way where he could dangle a carrot and say that I can make some more work for you, but just, you know, listen to me, maybe he would have gotten a little bit more of what he expected. You know, they respected Gaiman's wishes, and you know what? He every now and then he'll take a pay cut and make a fucking Sandman comic or, you know, a Batman story for them.
When I was in college in the 90s, you know, I was in school the second half of the 90s. Anytime I'd encounter somebody that kind of read comics, it was always Sandman. Men and women. You know, it was probably one of those early books where you start to see women coming into comics as readers. Sandman was always near the top of those lists.
Couldn't stand the look of it at the time when I was, you know, 9 years old. That just goes to show you that when you see mature readers on the cover, it doesn't mean pornography. It just means that the story is over your fucking little adolescent head.
As we're talking and I'm looking at the couple of Sandman covers here, Dave McKean work, amazing. Again, you know, compared to what you're seeing in the rest of this issue, I love Del Keown's Hulk, but it's different worlds, what you're seeing here, and the exposure to this kind of stuff, huge influence, you know, like you start to see, like, this is what comics can be. Right. What is that? What brush do you draw that with, you know? Recommended reading. Run through a couple of these. Sandman we've talked about.
Yeah, the first section is Neil Gaiman specific.
Violent Cases. I just picked this up recently. Published in America by Tundra. Tundra, I'm sure we'll talk about, you know, moving forward, but it's Kevin Eastman's company. I think I may have said in the past, it's a publisher I find interesting still to this day, so when I see something by them, I'll often pick it up if I haven't already read it. Black Orchid, another Vertigo, you know, Karen Berger editing.
With David McKean as well.
Yeah, Dave McKean interiors. Miracleman.
That was a bleeding edge comic, by the way. Like, it didn't quite hit the mark, wasn't all there, but those guys went places afterwards.
They sure did. And I mean, they look different than any other comics on the market. You know, that Black Orchid became a regular series then, and it was much different visually than the limited series that Dave McKean and Neil Gaiman had done. Miracleman. Most people, I think, associate Miracleman with Alan Moore's run on the character. Neil Gaiman actually took over, I think it was the fourth book. You know, that was kind of structured in almost a graphic novel format where there were long story arcs. Good Omens.
with Terry Pratchett. Like I read that book when I was a kid. Really dug it.
Pretty cool. I've never read it, so that was one of his early novels.
It was, and it was almost like Pratchett held his hand a while he embarked on his first major prose book. Like I know he wrote. Was it a book on like Duran Duran or something?
I had no idea.
Yeah,
I knew he came out of like
journalism.
Yeah, rock journalism.
Yeah,
pop culture journalism. Words Without Pictures. Have you ever heard of that?
I've never heard of it.
Me either. This is what I would find in Palmer's Picks, though. You see this list, right? This was an anthology book, short stories. Alan Moore, obviously know him. Steve Bissette, a guy I've gone on to really admire his work. Mark Evanier. But this is where I would find like different creators, different books. Palmer's Picks was like this whole new vein of comics.
Right.
You know, it was a bunch of books I had never heard of, which was great. You know, give me something new to try to find. For those not interested in Neil Gaiman, but looking for something good to read, From Hell, Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's Jack the Ripper comics, early days. You know, like there are two volumes at this point.
Yeah, it would be serialized at this time. It was serialized in Steve Bissette's Taboo anthology that he self-published through his imprint Spider Baby Graphics, and I think they may have collected an issue like some of those stories into their own kind of standalone volumes.
Yeah, that was an early mail order for me, where some of those collected From Hell, about 48 pages or something. Little, you know, they're bigger than a comic book, but not a graphic novel yet.
I still kick myself for when I saw From Hell pages at the Pittsburgh Comic Con going for $60 a piece.
My first or second SPXs, there were still From Hell pages being sold, maybe $100, but I think they were less than $100, and some were beautiful, like nice pages. That's another one I regret too.
At those times, though, man, $60 when I was 12 years old might as well have been $6,000.
For sure. Cerebus. This is great. So a 300-issue limited series by Dave Sim and Gerhard. Cerebus was just always there when I was reading comics. It preceded me. I think it started in 77 maybe, so like maybe it's been there my entire life.
Sure.
At this point, one thing, if people don't know what Cerebus is, Dave Sim self-publishing a 300-issue series that was going to chronicle the life of the main character, Cerebus, an aardvark. They're about 150 issues in at this point.
Halfway through.
Incredible. Hate, Peter Baggs' series at the time. His previous comic, Neat Stuff, and then collections that have come out of his work.
Yeah, the whole Pete Bag catalog, and that, you know, I'm always a fan of rooting the issue that we cover in a point in time. So Hate was the poster child of like the grunge movement. So the earliest like Nirvana records are coming out at this point, and we're starting to see, you know, your girlfriend is still in your flannel sweatshirt, you know what I'm saying? And putting on your army boots
and Bag is kind of the comics voice of that.
Always closely associated with the grunge movement. That guy, he's actually a very important guy in my career, man, because even at this time, Hate was being optioned to death. Like once, you know, MTV got a hold of it at a certain point, some other network got a hold of it for, you know, an inevitable animated series that just never saw the light of day. So he got mixed up with a lot of these animation executives, and I would say 2010 maybe 2009, some executive was sniffing around about, you know, does anybody have this kind of style that is a mix between X and Y, and what X and Y is, I don't want to say just because it's embarrassing to me. But my name came up, and working on this animated series that he helped me get, it gave me the capital to finish my WYSIWYG comic, and I lived on that for the very first volume of Hip Hop Family Tree as I was putting that together. Like these books from this recommended reading section that aren't the Neil Gaiman books, these are books that are done on spec. The cartoonist just is at home inventing something with no promise of receiving $1. So very often you have to make your living some other way. And every time I see Peter Bag, I offer to paint his house, mow his lawn, because he legitimately helped change my life in a very positive way.